Welcome to this presentation titled The State of the United States Economy and Society. I'm Edward J. Dodson, and this is a presentation in longer form from one that is presented at the Cherry Hill Public Library on March 16, 2026. The material came from a course that I've been teaching. It grew out of work I did in connection with my responsibilities as a business manager and market analyst in the Housing and Community Development Group at Fannie Mae, and continued to do for subscribers after retiring in 2005, and I kept performing this analysis up until 2019. With the election of the current president and in recognition of the drastic changes in public policy he has initiated, I wanted to create a fact-supported starting point with the intention of preparing an update each spring and for at least the next few years. I am convinced by the study of past economic cycles that we are in uncharted waters. The issue is not whether the cycle will continue as it has for nearly 2 centuries, with busts occurring almost like clockwork every 17 to 21 years. What we are about to learn is how long we will remain in a recession and how severe this next recession might be. What I offer to you has come from a combination of my formal study of economics and what I learned over the past years from economics professors who shared unconventional perspectives on the causes of our boom-to-bust prone economic system. This image is simply a collection of the 6 economists that I've spent the most time working with over the years. As a business major in college, I took the required courses in micro and macroeconomics. At the end of my junior year, I took a summer job working for Pete Kostemeyer, the press secretary to Shane Kramer, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Something happened during those few months that introduced me to what is a driving force and leading indicator of where our economy is in the cycle shown in the above slide. Milton Schaap, the governor of Pennsylvania, had introduced a land resources policies and programs report that was being discussed at public forums held across the state, including the state capital, Harrisburg. The issues interested me as a young person already concerned about sprawling development taking up vital agricultural land. I asked the press secretary if I could attend. He assigned me the task of taking notes and writing a report, and I went to the forum. One of the presenters at this public forum was a city planner from York, Pennsylvania, named Albert Heidemann, chairman of the Pennsylvania State Community Development Commission. During his presentation, he discussed the problem of sprawl, indicating that a primary cause was the traditional form of real estate taxation, which applied the same rate of taxation to the assessed value of property improvements as was applied to land values. He explained why this is a very flawed public policy. Mr. Heidemann argued the case for Pennsylvania communities to gradually implement a different and much lower rate of taxation on property improvements, which are depreciating assets, than on land values, an asset which does not under most circumstances depreciate. At my request, he sent me a number of articles on the issue, where I learned that the idea came from proposals made late in the 19th century by Philadelphia-born political economist Henry George. George actually argued the case for the elimination of all taxation, to be replaced by the public capture of the annual rental value of land and other natural assets with an inelastic supply, such as frequencies on the broadcast spectrum or takeoff and landing slots at airports, as well as competition limiting licenses issued by government, such as liquor licenses or taxi medallions. Fast forward to 1980. I was managing the residential mortgage loan program for Provident National Bank in Philadelphia and had become involved with community groups trying to bring investment back into some of the Philadelphia distressed neighborhoods. At one of the meetings, a community activist talked about trying to get the 2-rate property tax adopted in Philadelphia. Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and other Pennsylvania cities had done so with good results. He mentioned Henry George and that I might learn more at the Henry George School of Social Science located on South 10th Street. I remembered the material Al Heidemann had sent me, pulled it out of my files, and reread it. I called the school, and after work one evening, I walked there from my office at 17th and Sansom Streets. I met the director, had a good chat with him, and he convinced me I might learn something by taking the school's one-year program. That year changed my thinking and my life. At the end of that year, I was invited to join the school's all-volunteer faculty. That was 1981, and I have been on the school's faculty ever since. The school's main facility has been in Manhattan since 1932. The Philadelphia location closed in 2015. So these days, the courses I teach for the school are all offered on Zoom. Every few months, I also do an interview program for the school called Smart Talk. This image from one program featured British economist Fred Harrison talking about the effects of Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Fred has authored about a dozen books since the early 1980s and has a huge presence on YouTube. In a world that is now populated by over 8 billion people, the challenges of providing basic living for as many as 10% of this number who live on the edge are enormous. Our planet is finite. We hope that new technologies may come forward in time before fossil fuels either run out or before we release so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that the planet's life-supporting systems break down. We in the United States are the world's greatest consumers of natural resources, and we have yet to produce these goods in an environmentally sustainable manner. Moreover, the monetary system that has, since the end of the Second World War, allowed the United States government to create currency balances out of thin air and to spend without having to use taxation to balance the budget, is on the verge of collapse. Riyadh and Beijing have accelerated talks to price some oil sales in yuan rather than dollars, reflecting China's status as Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer. In June 2024, the Saudi Central Bank joined Project M-Bridge, a multi-country trial exploring central bank digital currencies for cross-border payments, which could eventually bypass traditional dollar-based systems like SWIFT. Iran has effectively shut down the world's most vital oil artery, through which 20% of global oil, roughly 20 million barrels per day, typically passes. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, and the UAE have been forced to shut down numerous oil fields and LNG facilities because they cannot export their products and their storage capacity is full. Here in the U.S., gasoline prices have already increased significantly. Interest rates on U.S. debt are currently rising as a direct consequence of the oil crisis and the conflict with Iran. In early March of 2026, the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield surged past 4%, reaching 4.27% by March 12th, marking its steepest two-week climb in nearly a year. The war is estimated to cost approximately $1 billion per day, further bloating the national debt and forcing the Treasury to offer higher yields to attract buyers. Clearly, we are now experiencing severe shocks to the nations and the global economic structure. This is occurring at a moment when the current economic cycle, which for several hundred years has regularly gone from boom to bust every 17 to 21 years. Sadly, too few economists have developed a sound understanding of the causes of economic cycles and how to end them to the extent possible. When one examines what occurs in the real world, there is strong evidence that mainstream economic theory and the public policies derived from accepted theory have contributed to our problems. It is no secret that the discipline of economics has been the subject of increasing criticism for the failure of most economists to provide meaningful insights into the causes of our boom-to-bust prone economic system. For many reasons, economics has long been referred to as the dismal science, or as not a science at all. Fortunately, there have been professional economists and other economic analysts who devoted themselves to application of scientific investigation of economic matters. One is Professor Fred Foldvari, whose photograph I included earlier. He was one of the pioneering economists whose research on economic cycles confirmed the existence of the 18-year average cycle regularly going back to the 19th century. In Chapter 12 of his 1990 book, The Science of Economics, he focused on the nature of the business cycle. He relied on this research to predict in 2007 what he wrote would be the Depression of 2008. He said, "There are two causes of the business cycle. One is financial and the other is real. The financial cause is the expansion of money and credit by the banking system. This monetary expansion lowers interest rates so that banks can loan out the extra money. Low interest rates induce a greater investment in and purchase of real estate. The real side of the business cycle is this increase in construction and in real estate speculation." At the height of the economic boom, real estate prices are high and interest rates are rising. These higher costs choke off further construction and buying, so the rate of growth of the economy falls. The continuing slowdown stops the expansion, and as investment falls, the demand for goods also falls, and the whole economy then falls into a recession and then into a depression. One of the most commonly referred to measures of the health of our economy is gross domestic product. At least some economists have acknowledged that this is a very flawed measurement that blinds us to issues deserving a strong policy response. A serious analytical problem is the reporting by mainstream media that an increase in GDP means the economy is growing. That is not necessarily the case. Further analysis is actually required. GDP includes all spending by government regardless of the source of funding, whether from taxes, borrowing, or monetary expansion by the Federal Reserve and banking systems. More than this, there is no qualitative judgment regarding what the spending is for. The British economist John Maynard Keynes argued during the Great Depression of the 1930s that it would be good for an economy if people were paid to dig holes than paid to fill them up again, even though nothing useful was produced. The recipients would have some income, would spend it on something, and gross domestic product would increase. A change in the calculation of GDP using the purchasing power of the dollar in 2017 to counter inflation shows a significant drop during the COVID-19 pandemic, followed by a return to an upward climb. The projected nominal GDP for 2026 is just under $32 trillion. Without a detailed analysis of what the spending will be for, one cannot reach any conclusions about the actual financial situation of households or individuals. The other elephant in the room is our public debt, which has skyrocketed beginning with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, when it finally reached $1 trillion and stood at $2.6 trillion when Reagan left office in January of 1989. With the vast increase in military spending and on the cost of fossil fuels, the debt is increasing today at an accelerating rate. Our federal government does not raise enough revenue via taxation and other fees to pay for what government spends. The total debt owed by the U.S. government is now around $39 trillion and climbing fast. Servicing this debt is forecasted to cost $1 trillion in 2026. The federal government collected only $5.23 trillion in revenue in fiscal year 2025. Thus, servicing the public debt absorbs nearly $1 out of every $5 in federal revenue. This cost is certain to increase significantly if spending is not reduced, if tax revenue does not increase, and if the interest rate on newly financed debt also increases during 2026 and subsequent years. Something else to be very concerned about is the rising level of consumer debt and how many Americans are falling behind in their payments. As of the fourth quarter of 2025, total U.S. household debt reached a record $18.8 trillion, according to the latest Federal Reserve Bank of New York Household Debt and Credit Report. This represents a cumulative rise of approximately $740 billion over the course of 2025. Around $13 trillion of the total is mortgage debt. Within the political arena, there continues to be great discussion and debate over stimulating the economy by a massive infusion of spending to repair and rebuild the nation's infrastructure. President Trump's plan is to use $200 billion in federal funds to spur at least $1.5 trillion in infrastructure investments with partners at the state, local, tribal, and private level. Success will require new taxes and borrowing by state and local governments. The model for systemic reform embraced by most Republicans is to dramatically reduce federal intrusion into matters deemed constitutionally within the authority and responsibility of the states. Following the great funding freeze of 2025, federal grant making has resumed, but with a 33% decrease in available opportunities compared to early 2025. Some states will be hit far heavier than others by reducing revenue shared from the federal government. An understanding of the working of land markets, whether urban, agricultural, valued based on trees to be harvested, or subsurface minerals or resources that can be taken from the seas and seabeds, is key to an understanding of local, national, and international economies. This is the power of land markets. A better understanding of basic economics would help the states solve their fiscal challenges and to develop tax and other policies that lead to the highest, best use of land while reducing conversion of remaining agricultural land with sprawling, low-density development. Every public investment in infrastructure results in windfall gains to owners of adjacent and nearby locations. The public capture of these gains could significantly lower the amount of debt incurred by infrastructure spending. The economics are straightforward. Every parcel or tract of land in a community has some potential annual rental value. This rental value is capitalized by forces of supply and demand, as strongly influenced by property law, taxation, and other public policies, into a potential selling price. The rental value of a location is directly related to locational advantage, and locational advantage is directly related to the quality of public goods and services available to the location. As communities and the state invest in new infrastructure, owners of land experience unearned windfall gains in land value. If communities want to stimulate investment in job creation, construction of new buildings, and renovation of existing structures, all that is needed is to begin reducing the taxation of these physical assets and gradually capture a higher and higher percentage of land's rental value. The economic and social benefits of moving in this direction are well documented. Those who embrace free market principles might be surprised by remarks made by economist Milton Friedman. He stated, "There's a sense in which all taxes are antagonistic to free enterprise, and yet we need taxes. In my opinion, the least bad tax is the property tax on the unimproved value of land." He adds this, "Governments can collect taxes best on things that don't move. Land is an ideal basis of taxation because you can't take it away." Friedman's lesson is easy to understand. As the annual tax imposed on the owner of a parcel of highly valuable vacant land, the owner has a strong financial incentive to bring the land held to its highest best use or sell to someone who will. Real economic activity results and employment opportunities are created. The monetary value of goods and services imported by U.S. businesses and consumers is significantly greater than the value of goods and services U.S. businesses export. The reasons for what is referred to as a trade deficit are many. A lower cost of production, subsidies by foreign governments, quality that cannot be matched domestically, lower costs of raw materials are all factors. The question is whether tariffs level the playing field or will cause a serious recession, worsening unemployment and a global economic contraction. While a protective tariff may make it profitable for producers in the United States to begin producing goods currently imported, provided potential customers can afford to pay the increased prices. Tariffs also result in increases of the cost of raw materials and resources not available in the United States. When the United States adopted a high tariff policy in 1930, the result was to turn recession into the Great Depression. In 1932, the era's most famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, offered his advice on how to rescue the global economy and avoid financial collapse. Each nation, in an effort to improve its relative position, takes measures injurious to the absolute prosperity of its neighbors. And, since its example is not confined to itself, it suffers more from similar action by its neighbors than it gains by such action itself. Competitive wage reductions, competitive tariffs, competitive liquidation of foreign assets, competitive currency deflations, competitive economy campaigns, all are of this beggar my neighbor description. The modern capitalist is a fair weather sailor. As soon as a storm rises, he abandons the duties of navigation and even sinks the boats which might carry him to safety by his haste to push his neighbor off and himself in. Keynes would not be surprised by what analysts at J.P. Morgan Research expressed on March 7 of 2025, that there is a 40% risk of global recession occurring because of the administration's shift in the application of tariff policy. Tariffs are certain to negatively impact U.S. exports of agricultural products. Exports to China, Mexico, and Canada have represented 1/2 of U.S. food exports. Even with the level of tariffs held over from the first Trump administration and continued under Biden, the U.S. imported a greater dollar value of food than it exported, technically creating a trade deficit in food. The U.S. agricultural trade deficit for fiscal year 2026 is projected to narrow significantly to $29 billion, marking a major improvement from the roughly $43.7 billion to $50 billion deficit seen in fiscal year 2025. Stronger export projections, including gains in dairy, corn, and ethanol, are driving this anticipated 43% reduction in the trade gap. The farm share of U.S. food dollar is 11.8 cents as of the latest data released on March 10, 2026. This represents a decrease of 3/3 of a cent from 12.1 cents in 2023. The decrease in the farm share is largely attributed to a shift in consumer behavior toward food away from home, restaurants and takeout, which increased to $1.27 trillion in 2024. Farmers receive a lower share of these dollars because the food requires significantly more processing, transportation, and service labor before reaching the consumer. Last November, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy forecasted that if just a 20% tariff was imposed on imported goods from all trading partners except China at 60%, the poorest fifth of Americans with incomes of $29,000 or less would experience a tax increase in 2026 equal to 5.7% of their income. Another serious problem is the concentrated control over almost all that is produced. Even before the start of the evolving trade war, climate change was forcing many producers to rapidly restructure their supply chains and consider expanding operations in the United States. An issue yet to be addressed is whether some firms, such as Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, or Apple, have become too dominant in their respective sectors and should be broken up. In 2026, Walmart's share of the U.S. retail market is approximately 6.04%. Despite intense competition, the company reported sustained market share gains across multiple income brackets throughout fiscal year 2026, driven primarily by its grocery dominance and a significant surge in e-commerce. The majority of market share gains in early 2026 came from households earning more than $100,000 annually, who are increasingly using Walmart for both value and convenience. Amazon dominates e-commerce in general, selling 74% of all e-books and 64% of all print books sold online. Two firms, Dean Foods and the Dairy Farmers of America, control between 80 to 90% of the milk supply chain in many states. More details on the concentration of various segments of the economy are available on the website of the Open Markets Institute. In January of 2025, a World Economic Forum report identified the following countries rapidly investing in manufacturing: Singapore, Brazil, India, Bangladesh, and Mexico. Is foreign investment in the United States on the rise? There has been some rather interesting news on this front. On his first day in office, President Trump signed an executive order announcing plans to revoke Biden's executive order on the implementation of the energy and infrastructure provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. The main objective of the act was to encourage U.S. companies to invest in clean energy. And the effect on the Trump decision so far? Since the beginning of 2025, U.S. manufacturing has seen a massive surge in private sector investment commitments, particularly in semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and advanced technology. Total announced industrial investment commitments for 2026 alone have been estimated at approximately $1.557 trillion. During its long existence, the Federal Reserve System has used its limited tools in an effort to find the right equilibrium price for money and credit, the objectives being twofold: preventing or softening recessions and preventing or softening inflation. The Fed primarily uses three main policy tools to influence the economy: open market operations, the discount rate, and reserve requirements. The effectiveness of the Fed's tools is revealed in the next slide. How severely inflation affects you depends on whether your nominal income increases each year at a rate equal to or greater than the loss in the dollar's purchasing power. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has experienced 14 recessions, with the most recent being in 2020. These recessions have varied in duration and severity and have been caused by a range of factors, including post-war adjustments, inflationary pressures triggered to a large extent by the rise in the cost of land and natural resources, and major economic events like the 2007-2009 Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember that back in the 1970s, we experienced both high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, what was referred to as stagflation. Prices for many goods had been climbing for years as resources were diverted from general consumption to production of war materials required for the U.S. involvement in the Vietnamese War. The trigger then was the formation of OPEC as a cartel controlling both the supply and price of oil exported to the world's most fossil fuel dependent economies, including the United States. The Fed has for decades now facilitated government borrowing by essentially creating money out of thin air, referred to as quantitative easing, which is then used to invest in government securities. Economist William Luther, director of the Sound Money Project, itself the subject of considerable debate at the American Institute for Economic Research, explains the process. The Fed is a banker's bank. That is, banks hold deposits at the Fed much like you or I might hold deposits in a checking account at Chase or Bank of America. That means when the Fed purchases a government bond from a bank or makes a loan to a bank, it does not have to and usually doesn't pay with cash. Instead, the Fed just credits the selling or borrowing bank's account. The Fed does not print money to buy assets because it does not have to. It can create money with a mere keystroke. So, as the Fed buys treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, corporate debt, and other assets, money will rarely change hands. It will just move from one account to another. Indeed, there are two potential costs of creating money that one should keep in mind. The first results from inflation, which denotes a general increase in prices and, correspondingly, a fall in the purchasing power of money. The other cost is a consequence of reallocating credit. A small group of renegade economists argue that public debt does not really matter, inasmuch as the Federal Reserve is authorized to create whatever additional monetary units are needed to pay the interest on outstanding debt. Other monetary reformers argue that money creation should be transferred to the U.S. Treasury, which would issue and spend debt-free money directly into the economy. The challenge would be to do so while not causing a surge in inflation. Rent-seeking and deadweight losses are both related to the inefficiencies and costs associated with market interventions, particularly those involving government policies. Rent-seeking refers to the pursuit of private gains through the manipulation of political processes or regulations, often at the expense of others. Deadweight loss, on the other hand, represents the economic inefficiency and lost welfare resulting from such interventions, such as market distortions or price controls. The institutionalization of rent-seeking privileges results in a redistribution of income and wealth from producers of goods and providers of services to non-producing, rent-taking interests. A major obstacle to reform and to a solution is that almost two-thirds of us materially benefit by the existing system to some degree. As of beginning of 2026, those of us who own a residential property enjoyed on paper approximately $35 trillion in equity based on the depreciated value of our housing unit combined with the potential sales value of the land on which the house is constructed. Rising land values added $2.5 trillion to the market value of all residential property, which reached $49.7 trillion by the end of 2024. As of early 2026, the total value of residential land in the United States is estimated at approximately $18.6 trillion to $20 trillion. This figure is part of a broader U.S. housing market that reached a record total value of $55.1 trillion in mid-2025. Land value accounts for roughly 41% of total household real estate assets. This chart helps to tell the story, but leaves out important facts. First, remember that existing housing units depreciate each year even when well maintained. Based on the $49.7 trillion total value quoted in the earlier slide, the total value of residentially improved land has climbed to around $20 trillion. Land is an asset that has a relatively inelastic supply and is often held for decades without development. The last property cycle peaked in 2007 and crashed the following year. If the historical data is predictive, 2026 will prove to be the new peak and the crash will occur in 2027, sooner if the Trump policies trigger a recessionary contraction. Given the continued upward climb in apartment rents and housing costs, we should not be surprised by the fact that homelessness increased by 18.1% in 2024 over 2023. The number of homeless in 2024 grew to 771,400, an increase of 118,300. However, analysis of local data from early 2025 suggests the national homeless problem may have shrunk by tens of thousands, reversing a years-long upward trend. Seniors aged 50 and older are the fastest growing group, now making up roughly half of the homeless population. Another aspect to the crisis of homelessness is what is referred to as the gentrification of city neighborhoods long occupied by lower income minority populations. A report issued in May of 2025 by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition states that 15% of urban neighborhoods show indications of gentrification. More specifically, there are 261,000 fewer black people living in gentrifying neighborhoods that were majority black, indicating considerable displacement since 1980. Estimates of displacement rates could range higher, with a decrease of 500,000 black people in all gentrifying neighborhoods. Philadelphia is one of the cities most impacted by gentrification displacement. Communities across the United States continue to struggle with the challenge of finding the revenue to subsidize construction of housing affordable to those most in need, even where the community might have public land that could be allocated. Only 66,000 affordable housing units were started during 2024. In 2025, U.S. affordable housing completions reached a multi-year peak of 78,377 units, a 12% increase from the previous year. This surge was driven by a wave of multifamily construction reaching the final stages of development, despite a broader slowdown in new project starts. So what's coming? Are we headed toward a new era of sustained economic growth, or is the economic cycle that regularly repeats every 18 years on average peaking and on a verge of a significant contraction? What should we expect given the details I have covered above? The federal workforce has seen a net reduction of between 238,000 to 264,000 employees since January 20, 2025. Between 317,000 and 335,000 employees actually departed, others hired by various departments. This represents a total workforce decline of roughly 10 to 11% during the first year of the administration. Over 92% of these separations were voluntary, primarily through the Deferred Resignation Program, which offered 8 months of pay and benefits for those who resigned by September 2025. Will the war with Iran end with a new era of stability in the Middle East and regime change in Iran? Will the U.S. dollar decline in value as countries decline to acquire U.S. government securities at any rate of interest because of the level of U.S. government debt? As I detailed early in this presentation, we are for many reasons in uncharted water with ongoing shocks to our economic structure. On April 10th of 2025, the House of Representatives adopted the Senate's version of the budget resolution, which included $5.3 trillion in deficit finance tax cuts. The problem is that these tax cuts did not distinguish between income that is earned producing goods or needed services and income that is derived because of rent-seeking privileges under law. I offer just one example of what is ignored. The rate of taxation on any gains experienced from the sale of financial assets is defined as a capital gain. The tax rates are effectively lower for many taxpayers whose income comes mostly from financial investments than the rate of taxation imposed on wages or salaries. Actual capital goods, buildings, machinery, technologies almost never sell for more than their cost of acquisition. The issues involve both economic efficiency and tax fairness. Why should gains experienced by investors engaged in speculation be given more favorable treatment than income earned producing goods or providing services? On May 16th of 2025, the program MoneyWatch summarized a report on the problem of rising costs of living on many U.S. households. The report was issued by the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity. This report concluded that for the bottom 60% of U.S. households, a minimal quality of life is out of reach. Their analysis of real unemployment is sobering. The Ludwig Institute also says that the nation's official unemployment rate of 4.2% greatly understates the level of economic distress around the U.S. Factoring in workers who are stuck in poverty wage jobs and people who are unable to find full-time employment, the U.S. jobless rate now tops 24%, according to Lispet, which defines these groups as functionally unemployed. An expectation of the Trump's economic team is that any reductions in taxation will stimulate a supply-side effect, that is, an expansion of economic output that will offset any loss in federal revenue at the lower marginal rates of taxation. Here I think we are again in uncharted waters. Supply-side tax cuts have not increased the ability of the federal government to balance the nation's budget. Is there a better way? Tax reformers might analyze the potential benefits of combining simplification of compliance with progressivity that untaxes earned income and increases the taxation of rent-derived unearned income. All income up to, say, the national median could be fully exempt from income taxation. All other exemptions and deductions would then be eliminated. Above the exempt level, an increasing rate of taxation would be imposed on higher ranges of income with the objective of achieving a balanced budget. Additionally, a tax foundation analysis of the tariffs on imported goods forecasted this would result in an average tax increase of nearly $2,100 per U.S. household during 2025. At the beginning of 2026, their estimate for 2025 was adjusted down to about $1,000. However, a Yale University study put the loss in purchasing power between $1,800 and $3,800. Well, that completes my analysis of the current situation. We'll have to wait a little bit to see if 2027 brings on the recession. Thank you.